He dreamed he was on fire. 3 times in a single night, the same vision returned. Flames, a whirlwind of sparks, voices whispering secrets about the nature of reality. When René Descartes woke on that November morning in 1619, he was convinced God had spoken to him. He was 23 years old, alone in a small room in southern Germany, and he'd just received what he believed was a divine mission to rebuild all of human knowledge from the ground up. This is the story of the man who doubted everything, and in doing so created the foundation of modern philosophy. A soldier who became a scientist, a Catholic who nearly destroyed religion, a Frenchman who died in the freezing courts of Sweden. His life reads like fiction, but every word is true. René Descartes was born on March 31st, 1596, in a small town in the Loire Valley that would later be renamed La Haye Descartes in his honour. His mother, Jeanne Brochard, died when he was just over a year old, likely from complications following the birth of another child. This loss marked him. He would later describe himself as having inherited from her a dry cough and a pale complexion that made doctors predict he wouldn't live past his youth. His father, Joachim Descartes, was a councillor in the Parliament of Brittany, a position of some standing. But Joachim was often absent, and young René was raised largely by his grandmother and a nurse. The household had money enough for comfort, but not for extravagance. They were minor nobility, the kind of family that had status without wealth, position without power. At age 8 or perhaps 10, the historical record is unclear on this point, René was sent to the Jesuit college of La Flèche in Anjou. This was among the finest schools in France, newly established and already gaining a reputation for academic excellence. The Jesuits were the intellectual elite of the Catholic Church, and their educational methods were rigorous. Students rose before dawn for prayers, attended lectures throughout the day, and studied late into the evening by candlelight. But young Descartes was sickly. That inherited weakness from his mother manifested in frequent illnesses. The rector of the college, Father Charlet, recognizing the boy's obvious intelligence and perhaps sympathizing with his fragile constitution, granted him an unusual privilege. René was allowed to stay in bed late into the morning, to rest while other students attended early prayers and classes. He could study in his room, think in solitude, work at his own pace. This exception would shape his entire life. Those morning hours in bed became his most productive time. For the rest of his days, Descartes would do his deepest thinking while lying down, often not rising until 11 in the morning. The habit began as medical necessity. It became method. At La Flèche, he studied everything the Jesuits could teach: logic, rhetoric, grammar, the classical languages, mathematics and natural philosophy, metaphysics and theology. He was a brilliant student, absorbing knowledge with the kind of hunger that teachers recognize and nurture. The Jesuits loved him. They saw in this pale, thoughtful boy a future ornament of the church, perhaps a great theologian or philosopher working in service of Catholic truth. But something was wrong. The more Descartes learned, the less certain he became. The authorities contradicted each other. Aristotle said one thing, more modern thinkers said another. In matters of natural philosophy, in questions about the physical world, the ancient texts were clearly incorrect. Yet they were still taught as gospel. In mathematics alone did he find certainty. 2 + 2 = 4, always, everywhere, for everyone. Geometric proofs held across time and space. Everything else seemed built on sand. He graduated in 1614 or 1615, around age 18, with a degree in law from the University of Poitiers. This was his father's doing. Joachim wanted his son established in a respectable profession, and law offered status and security. René complied, earned his degree, and immediately resolved never to practice law. He had no interest in legal disputes or parliamentary manoeuvring. He wanted truth, not argument. What does a young man of good family do when he doesn't know what to do? In the 17th century, the answer was often the same as it is now. He travelled. But Descartes didn't travel as a tourist, he became a soldier. In 1618 he travelled to the Dutch Republic and enlisted in the army of Prince Maurice of Nassau. This requires explanation because it seems bizarre. Why would a delicate, bookish young man join the military? The answer is that armies in this period were different from what we imagine. The 80 Years' War between Spain and the Netherlands was ongoing, but it was a war of sieges and engineering more than constant battle. Military service for a young gentleman was as much about education as combat. Armies needed engineers, mathematicians, men who could design fortifications and calculate trajectories. Descartes was never going to charge into battle swinging a sword. He was there to study military architecture, to learn practical mathematics, to see the world. It was a kind of finishing school with uniforms, and it was in the army that he met the man who changed everything. Isaac Beeckman was a Dutch mathematician and natural philosopher, older than Descartes by 8 years and far more advanced in his scientific studies. They met by chance in Breda. A mathematical problem was posted in Dutch on a public wall, a challenge to anyone who could solve it. Descartes, who didn't speak Dutch, asked a passerby to translate it for him. That passerby was Beeckman. They began talking. Within hours they were friends. Beeckman saw immediately that this young Frenchman had an extraordinary mind. Descartes found in Beeckman the first person who took his ideas seriously, who pushed him, who showed him that the new science, the mechanical philosophy that explained nature through mathematics and matter in motion, could replace the sterile Aristotelianism of the schools. For months they worked together. Beeckman set Descartes' problems in physics and mathematics. Descartes solved them, often with startling originality. They discussed everything: the nature of sound, the behaviour of falling bodies, the relationship between algebra and geometry. It was an apprenticeship disguised as friendship. Then in 1619, Descartes left the Dutch Republic and joined the army of Maximilian, Duke of Bavaria, on the Catholic side of the escalating conflicts that would become the 30 Years' War. Why the switch? Perhaps restlessness, perhaps political calculation, perhaps simple curiosity about other parts of Europe. He never explained. That winter, the army went into quarters in a small town near Ulm in southern Germany. There wasn't much to do. The troops waited out the cold months, and Descartes found himself alone with his thoughts in a rented room with a stove for warmth. He was 23 years old. He'd received the best education Europe could offer and found it wanting. He'd studied mathematics and found certainty. He'd studied philosophy and found confusion. He'd travelled through multiple countries and seen that customs and beliefs varied wildly. What was considered obvious truth in one place was regarded as dangerous error in another. How could anyone know anything for certain? The question consumed him. And then came the dreams. On the night of November 10th, 1619, alone in that heated room, Descartes had 3 dreams in succession. He recorded them later, and his account survives. In the first dream, he was walking through a street when a violent wind spun him around, forcing him to lean heavily to his left side to avoid falling. He saw a college chapel and tried to enter to pray, but the wind pushed him back. He noticed someone in the courtyard who greeted him kindly, but the wind continued to torment him, while others nearby stood upright without difficulty. He woke in pain, worried that an evil spirit was trying to seduce him. He prayed for 2 hours, asking God to protect him from the dream's evil effects. He fell asleep again. The second dream came immediately, a loud noise like thunder or an explosion. He woke terrified, seeing sparks of fire scattered through the room. This had happened to him before, he noted, these flashes of light when waking. It was a known phenomenon. He calmed himself, fell asleep once more. The third dream was different, peaceful. He found a book on his table, though he didn't know who'd placed it there. Opening it, he saw it was a dictionary. Then another book appeared, an anthology of poetry. He opened it at random to a poem beginning with the words, "What path shall I follow in life?" A stranger appeared and quoted another poem, "Yes and no." Descartes wanted to show him where it appeared in the anthology, but the books kept shifting and changing. The stranger disappeared. The books remained. He woke, and here's the extraordinary part. He interpreted the dreams while still in bed, before fully waking. The dictionary represented all the sciences gathered together. The poetry anthology represented philosophy and wisdom united. The wind was the evil spirit trying to force him toward error. The sparks were the spirit of truth descending. More than that, he believed God had just revealed to him his life's mission. He was to create a unified system of knowledge using mathematics as the model that would be as certain as geometry and would encompass all of science and philosophy. The dreams were a divine commission. We might diagnose this as the fevered imagination of an isolated young man in an overheated room during a bitter German winter. Descartes believed it was revelation, and whether the dreams came from God, indigestion, or an overactive mind wrestling with genuine intellectual problems, they gave him purpose. He spent the rest of that winter working out the basics of his new method. Knowledge should begin with what is absolutely certain and proceed by clear logical steps to build up more complex truths. Just as geometry starts with simple axioms and constructs elaborate proofs, all knowledge could be built from a foundation of certainty. The problem was finding that foundation. But before he could pursue this philosophical revolution, he had to finish his military obligations. And perhaps more importantly, he had to see more of the world. If he was going to rebuild human knowledge, he needed to understand what humans actually knew, believed, and practiced across different cultures. So when his military service ended, Descartes didn't go home. He travelled. Over the next several years, from 1620 to 1625, he wandered across Europe. We have only fragmentary records of these years. He went to Prague. He travelled through Germany. He spent time in Italy, making a pilgrimage to the shrine of Our Lady of Loreto to thank God for his visions. Though he went by way of the Alps and Venice, because why take a direct route when you can see more of the world? He studied water management systems in Venice. He attended the coronation of a pope in Rome. He watched street performers and studied probability with dice games. He met scholars and charlatans, learned about optics and anatomy, collected experiences the way other travellers collected souvenirs. He was building a database of human knowledge and error, seeing firsthand how much disagreement existed about even basic questions. And all the while, in rooms in various cities, he continued his private work on mathematics and his method. By 1625, he was back in France and his father was not pleased. René was approaching 30 with no profession, no position, no apparent prospects. He'd joined armies and quit them. He'd wandered around Europe like a vagrant. When would he settle down and do something respectable? The answer was never, at least not in the way Joachim Descartes hoped, because his son had no intention of becoming a lawyer or a courtier or a conventional scholar. He'd had his vision, he knew his purpose, he just needed the right conditions to pursue it. Paris in the 1620s was intellectually vibrant but socially exhausting. Descartes reconnected with old friends, made new ones, participated in the salon culture that was flourishing among educated elites. One friend, the mathematician Claude Midorge, introduced him to Marin Mersenne, a friar who had become perhaps the most important figure in Descartes' life. Mersenne was extraordinary, a scientist, a philosopher, a mathematician, and the centre of an enormous correspondence network that connected intellectuals across Europe. In an age before scientific journals, Mersenne's letters served that function. He would receive a discovery or theory from one scholar, write about it to 10 others, collect their responses, and distribute the conversation. He was a living, breathing scientific community. He and Descartes became close friends. Mersenne recognized Descartes' genius and became his champion, his agent, his intermediary with the wider world of learning. For the next 20+ years, they would correspond regularly. When Descartes wanted to publish something anonymously, Mersenne would arrange it. When other philosophers attacked Descartes' ideas, Mersenne would organize the defenses or sometimes the counterattacks. But Paris was too distracting. Too many social obligations, too many visitors, too many interruptions. Descartes needed solitude. He needed space to think. And so in 1628, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He moved to the Dutch Republic. Why the Netherlands? Multiple reasons converged. The Dutch Republic was Protestant, which meant less interference from Catholic authorities. It was tolerant by the standards of the age, with a relatively free press. It was prosperous and stable. It had excellent universities and a thriving intellectual culture. And crucially, it was foreign enough that Descartes could live there without being constantly bothered by French acquaintances who wanted to visit or invite him to dinner parties. He would spend the next 20 years there, moving frequently from city to city, sometimes from house to house, always seeking the perfect balance of solitude and access to books, instruments, and the occasional learned conversation. He never stayed anywhere long enough to establish deep roots. He was always a foreigner, always somewhat apart, always focused on his work. And what work it was! Because now, finally, after a decade of preparation and travel and military service and wandering, Descartes was ready to begin the project that the dreams had revealed to him. He would create a new foundation for all human knowledge. The method Descartes began developing in the late 1620s was radical in ways that are difficult to appreciate now. We live after him. We inherit his assumptions without realizing it. But in his time, what he proposed was genuinely shocking. Start with doubt. Doubt everything. Not as a game, not as intellectual exercise, but systematically and seriously. Take every belief you hold, every piece of knowledge you think you possess, and ask, could I possibly be wrong about this? Your senses tell you the world exists, but senses deceive. You've seen mirages, experienced dreams that felt real, mistaken distant objects. If senses can deceive sometimes, how do you know they're not deceiving you now? Mathematical truths seem certain. 2 + 2 = 4. A triangle has 3 sides. But what if there's an evil demon, immensely powerful and clever, who's devoted all his energy to deceiving you? What if this demon has so arranged things that you believe mathematical truths that are actually false? What if the entire structure of logic itself is a trick? This sounds absurd. It is absurd. That's precisely the point. Descartes wanted to find beliefs so certain that even this ridiculous demon hypothesis couldn't shake them. If something survived that test, it was genuinely indubitable. Most things didn't survive. The external world? Gone at least temporarily. Mathematics? Suspect. The testimony of others? Worthless since others might be part of the deception. Memory? Unreliable since the demon might be implanting false memories. Strip away everything doubtful, and what remains? One thing. One single, strange, undeniable fact. I am doubting. Even if a demon is deceiving me about everything else, the very act of being deceived requires that I exist. I can doubt whether my body is real, whether the world around me exists, whether mathematics is valid. But I cannot doubt that doubting is occurring. And if doubting is occurring, something must be doing the doubting. Therefore, I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum in the Latin formulation that would become philosophy's most famous phrase. The foundation was laid. Consciousness thought the existence of a thinking thing. This much was certain. Everything else would have to be built on top of it. Descartes worked on this project throughout the late 1620s and early 1630s. He wrote, revised, argued with himself, filled notebooks with attempts to get the argument exactly right. The structure was elaborate. From the certainty of his own existence as a thinking thing, he tried to prove God's existence. From God's existence and benevolence, he argued that clear and distinct perceptions must be true, since a benevolent God wouldn't systematically deceive us. From there, he could restore confidence in mathematics, in reason, and eventually in the existence of an external world. Modern philosophers argue endlessly about whether this structure holds. Does the proof of God's existence work? Is the criterion of clear and distinct perception reliable? Doesn't the argument become circular at crucial points? These debates continue, but the ambition of the project was breathtaking. Descartes genuinely believed he could reconstruct all human knowledge from a single, undeniable starting point. Meanwhile, he was also working on science. Physics, optics, meteorology, biology. The method applied everywhere. Break complex phenomena into simple parts. Doubt received wisdom. Build explanations using only clear principles. In 1633, Descartes was about to publish a major work. He called it The World. It was a complete system of physics, explaining everything from the formation of planets to the behavior of light. The cosmology was Copernican. The Earth moved around the sun, not the reverse. Then news arrived from Italy that changed everything. Galileo Galilei had been tried by the Inquisition and forced to recant his support for Copernican theory. The most famous scientist in Europe had been humiliated and threatened with torture for claiming the Earth moved. Descartes panicked. He immediately suppressed The World. He wrote to Mersenne explaining that he had no desire to be embroiled in controversy, that he valued peace and quiet above fame. He would not publish anything that might bring him trouble with religious authorities. This decision reveals something crucial about Descartes. He was brave in his thinking, but cautious in his life. He pushed ideas to radical conclusions privately, but avoided public confrontation. He wanted to revolutionize human knowledge without making enemies. This was perhaps naive. Revolutionary ideas make enemies whether you want them or not. For the next few years, Descartes published nothing major. He worked, corresponded with Mersenne and others, moved from city to city within the Dutch Republic. Leiden, Amsterdam, Utrecht, Zandpoort. Always renting, never quite settling. He had relationships with women during these years, though the details are sparse. In 1635, a woman named Helena Schanz gave birth to his daughter, Francine. Descartes never married Helena, but he acknowledged the child and provided financial support. He seems to have been genuinely attached to Francine. Friends reported that he spent time with her, that he spoke of her with affection. The little girl died in 1640 when she was only 5 years old, likely from scarlet fever. Descartes was devastated. He told friends it was the greatest sorrow of his life. He rarely spoke of her afterward. The private man behind the philosophical system suffered losses he could not rationalize away with method and doubt. But the work continued. In 1637, Descartes finally published something. Not his full philosophical system, not yet. Instead, he released a collection of 3 scientific essays on optics, meteorology, and geometry, plus an introductory text called Discourse on Method. The discourse was written in French, not Latin. This was deliberate and radical. Latin was the language of scholars, of universities, of official learning. Writing philosophy in French meant addressing a broader audience, including women and educated laypeople who hadn't been trained in classical languages. It was democratic in a way that academic philosophy rarely was. The book opens with Descartes' intellectual autobiography. He describes his education, his dissatisfaction with traditional learning, his decision to seek truth through his own reason rather than ancient authorities. He explains the 4 rules of his method: accept nothing as true unless clearly known to be so, divide problems into parts, proceed from simple to complex, Make complete enumerations to ensure nothing is missed. Then he drops the famous line, "I think, therefore I am," the foundation, the one certainty from which everything else follows. The discourse caused a stir, but not a scandal. Some readers were intrigued, others sceptical, many confused. What exactly was Descartes claiming? Was this a new philosophy, or just a method? Was he rejecting all traditional learning, or reforming it? The book raised more questions than it answered, which was probably intentional. Descartes was testing the waters, seeing how his ideas would be received before committing fully. The scientific essays that accompanied the discourse were more straightforward and arguably more impressive. The essay on geometry introduced what's now called Cartesian coordinates, the system of x and y axes that allows geometric problems to be expressed algebraically. This was a genuine breakthrough, one of the most important innovations in mathematics since ancient times. It united algebra and geometry, showed they were two aspects of the same underlying structure. Every graph you've ever seen in a math or science class uses the system Descartes invented. The essay on optics explained how lenses work, how the eye perceives images, how to grind lenses to correct vision problems. It was practical, useful, grounded in experiment and observation. This wasn't armchair philosophy. Descartes had actually dissected eyes, tested lenses, worked through the physics. The meteorology essay was less successful, filled with speculations about weather phenomena that turned out to be wrong. But even here, the approach was modern. No appeals to divine will or occult forces, just mechanical explanations based on the behavior of particles. Responses came in slowly. Some mathematicians praised the geometry. Some scientists questioned the physics. Theologians wondered about the implications for religion. Was Descartes a secret atheist? His proofs of God's existence seemed perfunctory to some readers, as if he was including them only to avoid trouble. Descartes defended himself vigorously in correspondence. He was not an atheist. He believed in God sincerely. His entire system depended on God's existence. Without divine benevolence guaranteeing that clear perceptions are true, the method collapses. He was trying to put religion on firmer rational footing, not undermine it. Whether he was being entirely honest is impossible to know. Private belief leaves few traces. What's clear is that Descartes was navigating a dangerous intellectual landscape. The Catholic Church was powerful and suspicious. Protestant authorities were sometimes more tolerant, but not always. A philosopher who challenged too many orthodoxies could find himself silenced, imprisoned, or worse. Through the late 1630s and early 1640s, Descartes continued refining his system. He corresponded with philosophers across Europe, arguing, defending, clarifying. Mersenne facilitated many of these exchanges, sending Descartes' letters to others and their responses back to him. One major debate concerned animals. Descartes had concluded, based on his philosophy of mind, that animals were essentially machines. They had no consciousness, no genuine thought, no souls. They were complex automata, like clockwork toys. When a dog yelps in pain, it's no different from a clock chiming the hour. Mechanical response, nothing more. This struck many readers as monstrous. How could anyone who'd spent time with animals believe they lacked consciousness? But Descartes was committed to the logic. Consciousness required a soul, an immaterial thinking substance. Animals showed no evidence of genuine thought, only mechanical reactions to stimuli, therefore no souls. The implications were stark. If animals were machines, you could do anything to them without moral concern. Vivisection, the practice of dissecting living animals for scientific research, was not cruel. It was no different from taking apart a clock to see how it works. Descartes himself performed vivisections. He cut open living animals to study their anatomy, their circulation, their nervous systems. He felt no guilt about this. They were machines. Machines don't suffer. Modern readers find this repellent, and rightly so. But it reveals how far Descartes was willing to push his principles. If the method led to a conclusion, He accepted it, even when the conclusion seemed to contradict obvious experience. By 1641, Descartes was ready to present his complete philosophical system. He'd been working toward this for more than a decade. The discourse had been an introduction, a preview. Now came the full argument, rigorous and systematic, addressing every major philosophical question. He called the book Meditations on First Philosophy. It was written in Latin this time, aimed at the learned audience that would judge its merits. The structure was careful and deliberate. 6 meditations, each building on the previous one, leading the reader through the entire process of doubt and reconstruction. Meditation. 1 establishes doubt. Strip away everything uncertain. Meditation. 2 finds the foundation. I think, therefore I am. Meditation. 3 argues for God's existence from the idea of perfection. Meditation. 4 explains how error is possible despite God's benevolence. Meditation. 5 offers additional arguments for God and proves the real distinction between mind and body. Meditation. 6 establishes the existence of the external world and explains the relationship between mind and matter. Before publication, Descartes did something unusual. He asked Mersenne to circulate the manuscript among leading philosophers and collect their objections. These objections would be published alongside the Meditations with Descartes' replies. The book would be a conversation showing both the theory and its defense against critics. The objections came from an impressive roster: Thomas Hobbes, the English political philosopher; Pierre Gassendi, a prominent French scientist; Antoine Arnauld, a theologian from the Sorbonne. Each raised serious questions. Each received detailed responses from Descartes. Hobbes objected that thinking doesn't prove the existence of an immaterial soul, only that thinking is occurring. Couldn't thought be a property of matter? Descartes replied that matter is extended in space, while thought has no spatial properties. Therefore they must be different substances. Gassendi attacked the proofs of God's existence, arguing they contained circular reasoning. Descartes insisted the reasoning was sound, that critics were misunderstanding the structure of his argument. Arnauld worried about theological implications. Did Descartes' philosophy leave room for Catholic doctrine about transubstantiation, the belief that bread and wine literally become Christ's body and blood during Mass? Descartes assured him it did, though the explanation was strained. The Meditations appeared in 1641, with all these objections and replies included. It was immediately recognized as a major philosophical work. Not everyone agreed with it. Many scholars remained committed to Aristotelian philosophy, the system that had dominated European universities for centuries. But no one could ignore Descartes. He'd presented a complete alternative, argued with systematic rigor, challenged every major assumption of traditional thought. Over the next few years, Cartesian philosophy spread through European intellectual circles. Young scholars began teaching it at universities, despite resistance from conservative faculty. Debates erupted about whether Descartes had really proven what he claimed. His ideas about mind and body sparked particularly intense controversy. How exactly does an immaterial mind interact with a material body? Descartes never gave a fully satisfactory answer to this question, and his followers struggled with it for generations. Meanwhile, Descartes himself continued working. He published Principles of Philosophy in 1644, an attempt to present his entire system in textbook form, suitable for university teaching. He wrote about passions, about the relationship between mind and emotions. He continued his scientific work, always looking for ways to apply his method to new problems. But the quiet scholarly life he'd built in the Netherlands was about to be disrupted by an invitation from one of the most powerful people in Europe, an invitation that would ultimately kill him. In the summer of 1649, a letter arrived at Descartes' house in the Netherlands. The seal bore the royal insignia of Sweden. Inside, an invitation from Queen Christina herself. She was 23 years old, brilliant, eccentric, and one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. She'd heard about Descartes' philosophy. She wanted him to come to Stockholm to be her personal tutor. Descartes hesitated. He was 63 now, and the Swedish climate was notoriously harsh. He'd spent 20 years building a comfortable life in Holland, surrounded by books and correspondence, free to work at his own pace. Why leave? But this was a queen. Refusing would be difficult, perhaps dangerous, and there was something appealing about the recognition, the chance to influence a young monarch who might spread Cartesian philosophy throughout her kingdom. Friends advised against it. Mersenne, his oldest confidant, warned that the journey would be too taxing. Others pointed out that Stockholm was far from the intellectual centres of Europe, that he'd be isolated, cut off from the network of scholars he'd spent decades cultivating. Descartes went anyway. He arrived in Stockholm in October 1649, just as winter was beginning. The city was nothing like Amsterdam or Paris. It was smaller, darker, colder. The sun barely rose in winter, the harbour froze solid. Wind cut through the streets like knives. Queen Christina kept irregular hours. She liked to conduct her lessons at 5 in the morning before her official duties began. This meant Descartes had to wake before dawn, dress in the freezing darkness, and walk through snow to the palace while most of the city still slept. For a man who'd spent his entire adult life working in bed until noon, who'd designed his whole routine around protecting his health and conserving his energy, this schedule was catastrophic. Within weeks he caught a cold. It worsened. By February, it had developed into pneumonia. The royal physicians were called, but their treatments were useless. Bloodletting, the standard medical practice of the time, only weakened him further. He refused some of their ministrations, knowing they'd do more harm than good, but the illness progressed anyway. On February 11th, 1650, René Descartes died in Stockholm. He was 63 years old. The irony was brutal. The philosopher who'd tried to understand the relationship between mind and body, who'd argued that the mind could exist independently of physical matter, died because his body failed him in a foreign city, teaching philosophy to a queen at an absurd hour. His death sparked immediate questions. Some whispered about poison. A French Catholic in Protestant Sweden, a philosopher whose ideas challenged traditional theology, dying suddenly after just a few months. Suspicions were inevitable. No evidence of foul play ever emerged. The simpler explanation was probably correct. An old man with a weak constitution, forced into a brutal routine in a harsh climate, simply couldn't survive. Christina arranged for his burial in Stockholm. But 17 years later, French authorities had his remains returned to Paris, where they were reburied with honours. Even in death, Descartes was caught between countries, between competing claims on his legacy. The philosophical system he'd built outlived him by centuries. Within decades, Cartesian philosophy had become the dominant alternative to Aristotelian thought in European universities. Students across the continent were reading the Meditations, debating mind-body dualism, arguing about innate ideas. But influence brought distortion. Later thinkers called themselves Cartesians, while disagreeing fundamentally about what Descartes had actually claimed. Some emphasized his rationalism, his trust in pure reason. Others focused on his scientific method, his insistence on systematic doubt. Different schools emerged, each claiming to be the true heir to his philosophy. The problem of mind-body interaction that Descartes had never fully solved became an obsession for his followers. Nicolas Malebranche proposed occasionalism, the theory that God coordinates mental and physical events, that mind and body don't actually interact directly. Spinoza went further, arguing that mind and body are two aspects of a single substance, God or nature, not separate substances at all. Leibniz developed his theory of pre-established harmony, claiming that mental and physical events run in parallel like synchronized clocks, never actually influencing each other. Each solution raised new problems. Each attempt to fix Cartesian dualism seemed to drift further, from what Descartes himself had intended. Meanwhile, empiricist philosophers in Britain were attacking Cartesian rationalism from a different angle. John Locke argued that the mind starts as a blank slate, that all knowledge comes from experience, not from innate ideas. Berkeley pushed this to radical conclusions, denying the existence of matter entirely. Hume followed with devastating skepticism, questioning whether we can know anything with certainty. The debate between rationalists and empiricists would dominate philosophy for the next century. And that debate was, in many ways, a response to Descartes. Whether they agreed or disagreed with him, every major philosopher after 1650 had to contend with the system he'd built. His scientific legacy proved more complicated. The mechanical philosophy he'd championed, explaining nature through matter and motion alone, became enormously influential. But his specific theories were often wrong. His vortex theory of planetary motion couldn't account for the precise observations that astronomers were making. Newton's law of universal gravitation, published in 1687, provided a better explanation. Descartes had rejected the idea of action at a distance, the notion that objects could influence each other without direct contact. Newton embraced it, and Newton's physics worked. Descartes' theories about light and optics were superseded. His ideas about animal physiology were abandoned. His ambitious attempt to explain all natural phenomena through a single mechanical system collapsed under the weight of empirical evidence. Yet the method survived. The insistence on mathematical precision, on reducing complex phenomena to measurable quantities, on looking for mechanical explanations rather than appealing to mysterious qualities. This became the foundation of modern science, even if the specific theories Descartes proposed didn't hold up. His coordinate system revolutionized mathematics. Analytic geometry, the fusion of algebra and geometry that Descartes invented, opened entirely new domains of mathematical investigation. Calculus, developed by Newton and Leibniz later in the century, built directly on Cartesian foundations. Every time a student plots a point on an XY axis, they're using Descartes' invention. Every time an engineer uses equations to describe geometric shapes, they're working within the framework he created. The notation we use, the way we think about mathematical relationships, the entire structure of modern mathematics bears his stamp. But perhaps his deepest legacy isn't in any specific theory or argument. It's in how he changed the starting point of philosophy itself. Before Descartes, philosophy typically began with metaphysics, with questions about the nature of reality. What exists? What is substance? What are the fundamental categories of being? Descartes shifted the starting point to epistemology, to questions about knowledge. What can we know? How can we be certain? What are the foundations of human understanding? This shift, often called the epistemological turn, redirected philosophy for centuries. Kant, writing over a century later, would still be working within this framework, still asking Cartesian questions about the limits and structure of human knowledge. The cogito, "I think therefore I am," became one of the most famous phrases in philosophy. Generations of students encountered it, memorized it, debated it. Was Descartes right that this was immune to doubt? Was self-awareness really the foundation of all knowledge? Critics found problems. Some pointed out that the cogito assumes too much, that "I think" already presupposes a thinker, an I that exists over time. Maybe Descartes should have stopped at "thinking is occurring" without jumping to conclusions about who or what is doing the thinking. Others questioned whether the cogito really proved what Descartes needed it to prove. Even if we grant that a thinking thing exists, how do we get from there to knowledge of the external world? The gap between "I exist as a thinking thing" and physical objects exist outside my mind seemed wider than Descartes acknowledged. The proofs of God's existence faced constant attack. Kant would later argue that all such proofs were impossible in principle. that you couldn't prove God's existence through pure reason. Hume had already suggested that the idea of a perfect being might just be an extrapolation from our imperfect experiences, not an innate idea planted by God. Mind-body dualism, Descartes' most distinctive metaphysical claim, generated centuries of debate. How can an immaterial mind cause a material body to move? How can physical events in the brain produce conscious experiences? These questions, framed in Cartesian terms, remain central to philosophy of mind today. Some philosophers rejected dualism entirely, arguing for materialism. Only physical stuff exists, and mental phenomena are just complex physical processes in the brain. Others defended dualism, but tried to solve the interaction problem in new ways. Still others developed entirely different frameworks, questioning whether the mind-body distinction was the right way to think about consciousness at all. Yet even those who rejected Descartes' answers often accepted his questions. The problems he identified, the puzzles he raised, the distinctions he drew, these became part of philosophy's permanent furniture. His influence extended beyond philosophy. The image of Descartes as the solitary thinker, doubting everything, rebuilding knowledge from the ground up through pure reason, became a cultural icon. The idea of the autonomous rational individual, trusting their own judgment over inherited authority, fed into Enlightenment ideals of intellectual freedom. Revolutionary thinkers in the 18th century, challenging political and religious orthodoxy, often invoked Cartesian principles. Question everything. Accept only what you can prove. Trust reason over tradition. These became battle cries for reform. But there was a darker side too. The mechanical philosophy, extended beyond its original scope, sometimes led to viewing humans as mere machines, nature as mere resource, animals as mere automata without feelings. Descartes himself had suggested that animals were just complex mechanisms, incapable of genuine thought or suffering. This view, though Descartes' followers often rejected it, gave philosophical cover to brutal treatment of animals. The radical separation between mind and matter, between the mental and physical realms, created conceptual problems that we're still wrestling with. How do we think about consciousness in a physical universe? How do we explain the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality? These are Cartesian questions, even if we reject Cartesian answers. In literature, Descartes became a symbol, sometimes of cold rationality, the philosopher who tried to reduce everything to mathematical precision, who dissected nature like a corpse. Sometimes of intellectual courage, the thinker who dared to question everything, who rebuilt human knowledge on foundations he tested himself. Both images captured something real. Descartes was both, methodical and bold, systematic and revolutionary, cautious and radical. His personal life remained largely hidden. The illegitimate daughter, Francine, who died at age 5. The relationships he formed and ended. The loneliness of his later years, moving from place to place, never quite settling. These human details were overshadowed by his intellectual legacy, but they mattered. The man who wrote about passions and emotions, who tried to understand the relationship between mind and body, had lived through losses and disappointments, had struggled with the limitations of his own flesh, had died far from home in pursuit of recognition. The philosopher and the person were not separate. The system he built came from a particular life, a particular set of experiences, particular fears and hopes and limitations. When we read the Meditations today, we're reading the work of someone who genuinely didn't know if he could rebuild knowledge after doubting everything. The uncertainty in those pages was real. The relief when he found the cogito, when he thought he'd discovered solid ground, that was real too. And the problems he couldn't solve, the questions he left hanging, the gaps in his system that his followers spent generations trying to fill, these weren't failures exactly. They were the honest result of pushing human thought as far as one person could push it. René Descartes changed how we think, not just about specific questions, but about the whole project of philosophy, about what knowledge is and how we get it, about where to begin when we try to understand ourselves and our world. The man is gone. The body that failed him in Stockholm has been dust for centuries, but the mind, the thinking thing he tried so hard to understand, lives on in every argument, every doubt, every attempt to find certainty in an uncertain world. Two roads stretched before the intellectuals of the 17th century: the road of reason, paved by Descartes, and the road of experience, championed by a group of English thinkers who would challenge everything the Frenchman had built. While Descartes sat in his Dutch study, spinning elaborate proofs from pure thought, a different approach was taking shape across the Channel. These English empiricists shared Descartes' desire for knowledge. They rejected his method entirely. Francis Bacon had fired the opening shot decades earlier. Knowledge comes from observation, from experiment, from systematic engagement with the natural world, not from sitting alone in a room thinking. But it was John Locke, born in 1632, the same year Descartes published his Discourse, who would mount the most devastating critique of rationalism. Locke's essay Concerning Human Understanding, published in 1690, attacked the very foundation of Cartesian philosophy, the idea of innate knowledge. Descartes believed certain truths were born with us, inscribed in the mind by God. Mathematical axioms, the principle that something cannot both be and not be at the same time. These seemed self-evident because they were built into human reason itself. Nonsense, said Locke. The mind at birth is a blank slate, a tabula rasa. Everything we know comes from experience, from sensation and reflection. Show me a child who knows the law of non-contradiction before learning it. Show me a society where mathematical truths are understood without teaching. You cannot, because they don't exist. The implications were staggering. If Locke was right, then Descartes' entire method collapsed. You couldn't sit in a room and deduce truths about reality from pure reason. You had to go out into the world, observe, experiment, test. Knowledge was empirical, or it was nothing. David Hume pushed even further. This Scottish philosopher, writing in the 1730s and 40s, took empiricism to its logical conclusion. And the conclusion was disturbing. Consider causation. We believe that one thing causes another. The fire causes the water to boil. The cue ball causes the 8 ball to move. But what do we actually observe? We see one event, then another. We never see the causation itself. We only see constant conjunction. Event A, then event B. Again and again. We assume connection. We never perceive it. And if all knowledge comes from perception, as Locke insisted, then causation isn't knowledge at all. It's just habit. Expectation based on past experience. This threatened everything. Science depends on causation. Natural laws are causal laws. If causation is just habit, if we have no rational justification for believing that the future will resemble the past, then science has no foundation. We're back where Descartes started, uncertain about everything, but Hume went further still. He turned empiricism against the self. Descartes had said the one thing we can be certain of is our own existence as thinking things. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What is this? Hume looked for it using empirical methods. When I examine my experience, what do I find? Sensations, thoughts, feelings, memories, a stream of mental events, but no self, no thinking thing standing behind these experiences observing them. Just the experiences themselves. The self, Hume concluded, is a fiction, a useful fiction perhaps, but not something we can actually observe. We bundle our experiences together and call the bundle a person. But there's nothing doing the bundling, just the bundle itself. If Hume was right, then Descartes' first certainty was wrong. There is no I, at least not in the way Descartes imagined. The battleground was set. Rationalists versus empiricists. innate ideas versus blank slate, reason versus experience. It would define philosophy for the next century. The debate wasn't just academic, it shaped how people thought about everything. Education. If Locke was right, then environment mattered more than inheritance. You could shape minds through experience. This fed into Enlightenment optimism, the belief that humanity could be improved through better institutions, better education, better exposure to the right experiences. Politics too. If there were no innate principles, then kings couldn't claim to rule by divine right. Political authority had to be justified through reason and experience, through social contract and consent. Locke's empiricism underwrote liberal democracy. Even religion felt the impact. If knowledge comes from experience, what do we make of religious claims? Miracles, revelation, doctrines about invisible realities? These didn't come from ordinary experience. They required faith, authority, tradition, exactly what the empiricists were challenging. Some tried to reconcile faith and empiricism. Others concluded that religion was superstition, mere habit dressed up as truth. The wedge between science and religion, which we now take for granted, was driven partly by this empiricist challenge to anything that couldn't be observed and tested. Meanwhile, the rationalists weren't surrendering. Leibniz, the great German polymath, constructed an elaborate response to empiricism. He tried to show that reason could still reach truths that experience never touched. Necessary truths about possible worlds, about the ultimate nature of reality. Spinoza had already offered a different vision. His ethics, written in geometric form, proof after proof, attempted to deduce everything from first principles: God, nature, human emotions, freedom, salvation, all demonstrated with mathematical certainty. It was magnificent. It was also strange, leading to conclusions that shocked readers. God and nature are identical. Free will is an illusion. Immortality means something completely different from what religion teaches. The rationalist method, pushed to its limits, produced results as disturbing as Hume's skepticism. The scientific revolution complicated everything. Newton had shown that you could use mathematics to describe nature with stunning precision. His Principia, published in 1687, combined empirical observation with mathematical reasoning. You started with phenomena, things you could observe and measure. Then you used reason to find the mathematical laws governing those phenomena. Was this rationalism or empiricism? Both? Neither? Newton himself tried to stay out of philosophical debates. He famously wrote, "I frame no hypotheses, just give me the mathematics that describes what actually happens. Don't ask me to explain the ultimate causes." But everyone else had to grapple with what Newton had done. He seemed to show that both reason and experience were necessary, that neither alone was sufficient. But how did they fit together? That question would haunt philosophy for generations. The debate reached Germany, where it found a young professor who had been raised on rationalism but couldn't ignore the empiricist challenge. Immanuel Kant spent years trying to solve the puzzle. How could knowledge be both necessary, like the rationalists claimed, and grounded in experience, like the empiricists insisted? His answer, published in 1781, attempted to split the difference. Yes, all knowledge begins with experience, but experience itself is only possible because the mind brings something to it. Structure, organization, categories that shape what we perceive. Space and time aren't features of reality itself. They're forms of human intuition, ways the mind organizes sensory data. We can't perceive anything except in space and time because that's how perception works for creatures like us. Causation isn't just habit, as Hume thought. It's a category of understanding, a concept the mind uses to make sense of experience. But it's not a feature of things in themselves either, as Descartes believed. It's something in between. Kant claimed he'd achieved a Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus showed that the Earth moves around the Sun, not vice versa, Kant showed that objects conform to our knowledge, not knowledge to objects, at least partly. The solution was brilliant. It was also complicated, and it didn't satisfy everyone. Some thought Kant had just smuggled rationalism back in through the side door. Others thought he'd conceded too much to empiricism. The debate continued, but something had shifted. After Kant, you couldn't ignore either side. Pure rationalism, the idea that reason alone could unlock all truths, was dead. So was pure empiricism, the notion that experience alone provided knowledge. Both were necessary. The question was how they worked together. This wasn't just philosophy changing, it was human self-understanding evolving. We were learning something about the limits of thought, about what minds like ours could and couldn't know. Descartes had started it. He'd asked what we could be certain of. He tried to rebuild knowledge from the ground up. His particular answers didn't survive intact, but his question persisted. What can we know? How do we know it? What are the limits of human understanding? Every philosopher after him had to engage with these questions. They still do. The methods changed, the answers evolved, but the core problem remained. We're thinking things trying to understand ourselves and our world. That's both our glory and our limitation. The Cartesian legacy wasn't just his specific doctrines. It was the idea that we had to think about thinking itself, that we couldn't take knowledge for granted. That certainty required foundation, and foundation required examination. Modern epistemology, the study of knowledge, is essentially footnotes to Descartes. Even when we reject his answers, we're responding to his questions. What grounds belief? What justifies claims to know? Where does certainty come from? These might seem abstract, but they matter practically. Science depends on epistemology. We need to know what counts as evidence, what makes a theory justified, when we should accept or reject claims. That's applied Cartesian doubt. Education is shaped by these debates. If Locke was right about the blank slate, then how we teach matters enormously. If there are innate capacities, as rationalists claimed and modern cognitive science suggests, then we need different approaches. Even personal identity, the sense of being a self that persists through time, gets entangled in these philosophical webs. Descartes thought the self was obvious, immediately known. Hume thought it was a fiction. Kant tried to find middle ground. We're still sorting it out. Neuroscience gives us new data, but the conceptual problems remain. What makes you the same person you were 10 years ago? What is consciousness? How does subjective experience relate to physical brain states? These are Cartesian questions in modern dress. The man who sat in a room doubting everything launched inquiries that haven't concluded. Maybe can't conclude. Maybe that's the point. Philosophy isn't about reaching final answers. It's about asking better questions, making distinctions, uncovering assumptions. The examined life requires examining the tools of examination. That's what Descartes taught us. The battle between rationalism and empiricism eventually transformed into something else. Neither side won completely. Instead, they merged and evolved into different approaches, different schools of thought that all acknowledged the insights from both camps. Pragmatism, which emerged in America in the late 19th century, basically said the debate was pointless. Knowledge is what works. Ideas are tools. Judge them by their consequences, not by whether they're purely rational or purely empirical. Phenomenology tried to describe experience directly, without presupposing either rationalist or empiricist answers. Just look at what appears to consciousness. Bracket the theoretical questions and attend to the phenomena themselves. Logical positivism attempted to use formal logic to clarify what we mean by knowledge, by truth, by meaning itself. It borrowed from both traditions, using rational analysis to understand empirical science. Each movement was responding, directly or indirectly, to the problems Descartes had raised and that the rationalist-empiricist debate had explored. The family tree of modern philosophy has Descartes near the root. Every branch grew from seeds he planted. But here's what's remarkable. the man himself would barely recognize most of what grew from his work. He thought he was establishing certainty. Instead, he showed us how uncertain everything is. He thought he was proving God's existence and the soul's immortality. Instead, he gave skeptics their sharpest weapons. He thought he was unifying mind and body. Instead, he created a dualism philosophers still struggle to overcome. The gap between intention and consequence has rarely been wider. But that's how ideas work. They escape their creators. They live in ways their authors never imagined. They combine with other ideas, mutate, evolve, sometimes turn into their opposites. Descartes wanted to build. He ended up teaching us how to demolish. He wanted certainty. He gave us better ways to doubt. He wanted to prove we're more than matter. He helped launch materialist science that would explain more and more of human life in purely physical terms. The irony is perfect and perfectly fitting, because the one thing Descartes definitely proved was this: thinking is hard, understanding is difficult, certainty is elusive. We're finite creatures trying to grasp infinite questions. We're embedded in nature, trying to stand outside it and see it whole. We're using minds to understand minds, which is like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The project is impossible, we attempt it anyway. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us philosophical. We can't help but ask questions we can't fully answer. We can't resist building systems that eventually crack under scrutiny. We're compelled to seek truth even when we suspect it might be unreachable. Descartes embodied this human condition, brilliant and limited, systematic and inconsistent, certain and doubtful. He was us, just more so. More brilliant, more systematic, more certain, more influential, but still human, still fallible, still ultimately unable to achieve what he set out to do. And that's fine, because what he actually accomplished without quite intending to was perhaps more valuable than what he hoped for. He didn't give us certainty. He gave us a method for pursuing it. He didn't solve the mind-body problem. He showed us why it's a problem. He didn't prove God exists. He demonstrated what proof would require. Human thought after Descartes could never be as innocent as it was before. We'd learn to question our own questioning, to doubt our own doubting, to examine the instruments of examination. That self-consciousness, that reflexivity, that turning of thought back on itself, that's the real Cartesian revolution. Everything else follows from that. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Not what Descartes proved, but what the attempt revealed. When you push rational thought to its absolute limit, when you demand perfect clarity and absolute certainty, you don't find bedrock. You find more questions. The system Descartes built was beautiful, architecturally perfect, logically tight, internally consistent, and completely vulnerable to anyone who asked the right question. His contemporary, Pierre Gassendi, did exactly that. A French priest and philosopher who read the Meditations and immediately saw the problems. If you doubt everything, Gassendi asked, why stop at the body? Why not doubt the mind itself? You say, I think therefore I am. But what is this I you're so certain about? You experience thoughts. Fine. But do those thoughts require a thinking substance, a unified self, a soul? Or are they just events, moments of awareness, flickers of consciousness, without a permanent container? Descartes had no good answer. He insisted the I was obvious, self-evident, undeniable, but that was assertion, not argument. He'd proven that thinking happens. He hadn't proven that a thinker exists as a distinct, unified, enduring entity. The gap was significant. Buddhism had noticed it centuries earlier. Western philosophy would rediscover it centuries later. Descartes missed it entirely. The body problem was worse. Descartes claimed mind and body interact through the pineal gland. This tiny structure in the center of the brain was, he suggested, where the immaterial soul made contact with the material body. Why the pineal gland? Because it appeared to be singular rather than doubled like most brain structures. Because it seemed centrally located. Because Descartes needed an answer, and the pineal gland was available. It was desperate speculation dressed as scientific hypothesis. Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia called him on it immediately. She was one of the few people who engaged Descartes as an intellectual equal, and she had no patience for hand-waving. In a series of letters that make for fascinating reading, she pressed him relentlessly. If mind is immaterial, she asked, how can it move matter? Movement requires force. Force requires extension. Extension is a property of matter. Immaterial substance, by definition, lacks extension. So how exactly does the soul push on the pineal gland? Descartes tried various answers. None worked. He suggested that the soul doesn't push exactly, it directs. Elizabeth wasn't satisfied. Direction is still a form of influence, and influence requires contact, and contact requires extension. Round and round they went. Descartes never solved it. He died in 1650 without answering Elizabeth's challenge. The mind-body problem remained exactly where he'd left it, except now everyone could see the problem clearly. That was progress of a sort. The God proofs fared no better under scrutiny. The ontological argument, the one that claimed God must exist because existence is part of perfection, was attacked immediately, and has been attacked continuously ever since. Kant would eventually deliver what many considered the fatal blow, but the criticism started much earlier. The problem is simple. You can't define things into existence. I can imagine a perfect island with every desirable feature. That doesn't mean such an island exists. I can define a bachelor as an unmarried man and know with certainty that all bachelors are unmarried. But I can't define a bachelor as an unmarried man who owns a yacht and thereby conjure yachts into existence. Existence is not a property you can include in a definition and then extract as a conclusion. Descartes thought it was different with God because God is unique, the only necessarily existing being. But that's circular. You're assuming God necessarily exists in order to prove God necessarily exists. The argument collapses under its own weight. The causal proof was slightly better but still problematic. Descartes argued that his idea of God must have been caused by God because effects can't exceed their causes. A finite being like Descartes couldn't produce an idea of infinity unless an infinite being implanted it. But why not? Humans create ideas all the time that exceed their own nature. We imagine perfection though we're imperfect. We conceive of immortality though we're mortal. We think about infinity though we're finite. The mind's ability to extrapolate, to negate, to combine concepts in novel ways explains all of this without requiring divine intervention. Every major argument Descartes offered eventually failed. Not immediately, not obviously, but steadily, as philosophers worked through the implications, the weaknesses emerged. His epistemology couldn't escape skepticism. His metaphysics couldn't bridge dualism. His theology couldn't compel belief. The entire system, so carefully constructed, began to crumble. Yet it mattered enormously, because the questions Descartes asked became philosophy's questions. What can we know for certain? How does mind relate to matter? Does God exist and can reason prove it? What is the self? Every major philosopher after Descartes was responding to these questions, either accepting his framework or rebelling against it. You couldn't ignore him. Even rejecting Descartes meant taking him seriously enough to refute. The scientific impact was equally profound. Cartesian mechanism, the view that nature operates according to mathematical laws without purpose or intention, became the foundation of modern physics. Newton built on Cartesian assumptions even while correcting Cartesian errors. The entire scientific revolution was, in significant ways, an extended conversation with and against Descartes. He gave scientists permission to treat nature as mechanism, to ignore final causes and focus on efficient causes. to mathematize, quantify, measure, to trust that nature's laws were rational and discoverable. These weren't obvious assumptions. Medieval science had been saturated with purpose, with qualities, with essences. Descartes helped strip all that away, leaving behind the clean, mathematical world that physics could actually study. The cost was meaning. Cartesian nature has no inherent purpose. It's not going anywhere. It's not for anything. It just is mechanical and indifferent. Humans were left trying to find meaning in a universe that Descartes had systematically drained of it. We're still dealing with that problem. The political implications took longer to emerge but were equally significant. Descartes himself was politically cautious, even conservative. He had no interest in challenging established authority, but his method was inherently revolutionary. If every individual can think for themselves, if reason is universal and accessible to all, if truth is discovered through personal inquiry rather than received from authority, then what justifies kings, priests, or any other power structure based on tradition rather than reason? The Enlightenment would take Descartes' method and turn it into a political weapon. If reason is sovereign, then perhaps sovereignty should rest with reason. If individuals can think for themselves, perhaps they should govern themselves. The path from "I think therefore I am" to "we the people" is not direct, but it exists. Descartes helped make democracy intellectually possible, even though he never advocated for it. The religious implications were even more dangerous. Descartes thought he was defending faith. He died believing he'd proved God's existence and the soul's immortality, but the tools he forged could cut both ways. If reason is the ultimate arbiter, if we accept only what we can clearly and distinctly perceive, if we reject authority and tradition in favor of individual inquiry, then what happens when reason finds religion wanting? Descartes didn't intend to arm skeptics and atheists, but that's exactly what he did. His method said, doubt everything until you find certainty. Many who followed that advice found certainty elusive. They doubted God, doubted revelation, doubted immortality, and found Descartes' proofs unconvincing. The modern secular worldview owes a debt to Descartes, even though he would have been horrified by it. This is the strange fate of philosophical systems. They escape their creators. They're used for purposes their authors never imagined. The tools designed to build one structure get repurposed to build another. Descartes wanted to secure Christianity against skepticism. He ended up giving skepticism its most powerful weapons. But maybe that's how progress works. Not through definitive answers, but through better questions. Not through solved problems, but through clearer understanding of why problems are hard. Descartes didn't solve much, but he showed us what solving would require. He demonstrated that casual assumptions won't work, that vague intuitions aren't enough, that if we want certainty, we need to earn it through rigorous argument. He failed to earn it. That's important. But the attempt mattered. Every philosopher who came after had to be better, more careful, more rigorous, more aware of the difficulties. You couldn't just assert anymore. You had to argue. You couldn't just assume. You had to prove. The bar had been raised permanently. Consider what philosophy looked like before Descartes. Scholastic debates about how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. Appeals to Aristotle's authority that settled nothing. Theological disputes that generated more heat than light. It was intellectually stagnant, trapped in reverence for ancient texts and medieval commentaries. Descartes cut through all of it. Forget Aristotle, he said. Forget tradition. Forget what you've been taught. Think for yourself. Start from scratch. Accept nothing on faith. Build your knowledge from the ground up, using reason alone. It was liberation. Sudden, dramatic, exhilarating. Philosophy would never be the same. The modern world is Cartesian in ways we barely notice. We take for granted that individuals should think for themselves. That reason is universal. that knowledge should be built on evidence and argument rather than authority, that we can and should question everything, that mathematics is the language of nature, that the natural world operates according to discoverable laws. Every one of these assumptions can be traced back, at least partly, to Descartes. He didn't invent modernity. No single person could. But he crystallized something, gave it philosophical form, made it systematic and defensible. Before Descartes, the modern world was scattered impulses and half-formed ideas. After Descartes, it was a program, a method, a vision of what human knowledge could become. The vision was flawed. We've spent 4 centuries finding the flaws, but the ambition was right. The idea that humans could understand their world through reason, that we weren't limited to received wisdom, that we could build knowledge systematically and progressively, that was worth pursuing even if perfect certainty remained elusive. Descartes sits at a hinge point in Western thought. Before him, philosophy looked backward, to ancient wisdom and divine revelation. After him, it looked forward to what reason and science might discover. He's the bridge between medieval and modern, between faith-based and reason-based approaches to knowledge. Neither side of that bridge would recognize the other without him connecting them. And here's what's fascinating. The further we get from Descartes, the more clearly we see both his brilliance and his limitations. We've solved none of the problems he raised. The mind-body problem remains unsolved. The problem of knowledge remains contentious. The relationship between reason and faith remains fraught. We've made progress, certainly. We understand the difficulties better. We've developed new tools, new frameworks, new ways of approaching old questions. But we're still working on Descartes' problems, still trying to understand how consciousness relates to physical brain, still trying to ground knowledge in something more secure than mere belief, still trying to reconcile scientific explanation with human meaning. The questions he made central remain central. That's the mark of a truly great philosopher. Not that they solved everything, but that they identified what needed solving. That's philosophy's ultimate test, not whether you got the answers right, but whether you asked the right questions. Descartes passed that test magnificently. But there's another dimension to Descartes that we haven't fully explored, one that explains why his ideas spread so rapidly, why they captured imaginations across Europe, why they became the foundation for an entire intellectual movement. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he lived. The contradiction was striking. Here was a man preaching systematic doubt, yet he maintained careful friendships with Jesuits and corresponded respectfully with theologians. He championed reason above all, yet he chose to live quietly, avoiding controversy when possible. He declared that truth mattered more than tradition, yet he published cautiously, always aware of political and religious dangers. Was this hypocrisy, or was it something more interesting? Consider his life choices. After leaving the Dutch Republic briefly for France, he returned to Holland and stayed there. 20 years in a country that wasn't his own, speaking a language that wasn't his native tongue, living among people whose customs differed from his upbringing. Why safety? Holland was the freest place in Europe. The Dutch Republic, with its decentralized government and thriving commercial culture, tolerated intellectual diversity that would have been dangerous elsewhere. You could publish ideas in Amsterdam that would get you arrested in Paris. You could question orthodoxy in Leiden without facing the Inquisition. Descartes understood this. He chose exile for freedom. He sacrificed home for the ability to think and write without constant fear. That's not hypocrisy, that's strategy. But the strategy had costs. He was lonely. His letters reveal a man who missed France, who longed for the intellectual community of Paris, who felt isolated in Dutch villages where few shared his interests. He had friends, certainly, brilliant correspondents like Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who challenged his ideas and pushed him to clarify his thinking. But friendship by letter isn't the same as community. He never married. never had children. His one daughter, Francine, born from a relationship with a servant named Helena Jans, died at age 5. Descartes was devastated. He called her death the greatest sorrow of his life. The philosopher who tried to doubt everything found one thing he couldn't doubt: grief. This personal dimension matters. It's easy to see Descartes as pure intellect, a thinking thing analysing other thinking things. But he was human. He felt joy and sorrow. He formed attachments. He made choices based on emotion as much as reason. The man who declared, "I think therefore I am," also loved, mourned, and struggled with the same human messiness that afflicts us all. His final years were shaped by one last gamble. In 1649, Queen Christina of Sweden invited him to Stockholm to be her personal philosopher. It was a tremendous honour. Christina was brilliant, educated, genuinely interested in learning. She wanted Descartes to establish an Academy of Sciences, to bring the new philosophy to Scandinavia. He hesitated. He was 53 years old, comfortable in Holland, increasingly frail. Sweden was cold, distant, foreign. But Christina was insistent, and perhaps Descartes, after decades of exile, wanted recognition, wanted to be valued, wanted to matter to someone with power. He went. It was a disaster. Christina wanted lessons at 5 in the morning, in winter, in unheated rooms. Descartes, who had spent his adult life rising late and working in bed, had to wake before dawn and trudge through Stockholm's frozen streets to instruct a queen who treated philosophy as morning entertainment. His health collapsed within months. He caught pneumonia. The royal physicians tried their treatments, probably making things worse. On February 11th, 1650, less than 4 months after arriving in Sweden, René Descartes died. He was 53 years old. His final words, according to witnesses, were in French: "Mon âme, il faut partir. My soul, it is time to depart." Even at the end, the dualist, still distinguishing between body and soul, still seeing himself as a thinking thing temporarily housed in failing flesh. The irony is almost too perfect. The man who proved his existence through thought, who declared the mind independent of body, who built an entire philosophy on the primacy of consciousness, was killed by pneumonia, by a bodily disease, by the very physical reality he'd spent his career trying to transcend. His enemies noticed. They said God had punished him for his presumption. His friends mourned. His ideas, already spreading across Europe, became even more influential. Death made him safe to celebrate. The controversial thinker became the revered philosopher. 16 years after his death, the Catholic Church placed his works on the index of prohibited books. The irony was rich. Descartes had tried so hard to remain orthodox, to prove that reason and faith were compatible. He'd bent over backward to avoid church condemnation, and they banned him anyway. But it didn't matter. The ideas were already loose. You can't ban what's already spread. Students were reading Descartes in secret. Universities were debating his method. Scientists were applying his principles. The genie was out of the bottle. Within a generation, Cartesian philosophy dominated European intellectual life. Not because the church approved, because it worked, because it explained things, because it gave people tools for thinking clearly about difficult problems, because it was, despite its flaws, a massive step forward. The legacy crystallized quickly. By 1700, you were either a Cartesian or you were defining yourself against Cartesianism. There was no neutral ground. His framework became the framework. His questions became the questions. Even philosophers who rejected his answers accepted his terms of debate. Think about what that means. A man writes some books. 50 years later, an entire intellectual tradition bears his name. 100 years later, his influence is so pervasive that people don't even realize they're thinking in Cartesian terms. 200 years later, his problems are still the central problems of philosophy. That's not just influence, that's transformation. That's reshaping the landscape so thoroughly that future generations can't see what came before. But here's what gets forgotten in all the talk about cogito and dualism and method. Descartes was wrong about almost everything specific. His physics was nonsense. His biology was fantasy. His account of the pineal gland was ridiculous. His proofs for God's existence convinced almost no one. His theory of innate ideas faced immediate and devastating criticism. The specifics failed, but the approach succeeded. That's the deeper lesson. You can be wrong about details and right about method. You can fail at execution and succeed at vision. Descartes showed what philosophy could be, even if he couldn't fully achieve it himself. The scientific revolution that followed him, the enlightenment that built on his work, the modern university system that treats reason as the path to knowledge, all of this flows from Descartes. Not because he discovered final truths, because he modelled a way of pursuing truth that proved remarkably productive. Question everything. Accept nothing on authority. Build systematically from foundations. Test your reasoning. Be willing to revise. Distinguish what you know from what you merely believe. These aren't just Cartesian principles. They're the principles of modern intellectual life. We live in a Cartesian world whether we know it or not. Every time you ask, how do I know that's true? You're being Cartesian. Every time you distinguish facts from opinions, you're using Cartesian distinctions. Every time you value logical argument over emotional appeal, you're following Cartesian priorities. The world he imagined, where reason guides humanity toward truth and away from superstition, hasn't fully arrived. Maybe it never will, but we're closer to it than the world he was born into. That's his legacy. Not perfection, but progress. Not certainty, but method. And the method keeps working. Scientists still use mathematical reasoning to understand nature. Philosophers still distinguish appearance from reality. Doctors still treat the body as a physical system while acknowledging the reality of consciousness. These are Cartesian moves, Cartesian frameworks, Cartesian assumptions so deeply embedded we don't even see them. That's the ultimate success for a philosopher. Not that everyone agrees with you, that everyone thinks through your categories, that your framework becomes the water we swim in, invisible because it's everywhere. Descartes achieved that. The thinking thing who doubted everything became the foundation for modern thought. The man who couldn't prove the external world exists gave us the tools we use to investigate it. The philosopher who split mind from body united them in a single intellectual tradition. He was flawed, deeply, obviously flawed, but he was also necessary. Someone had to break with medieval philosophy. Someone had to say, start over, think fresh, build from scratch. Someone had to take the risk of systematic doubt and see where it led. Descartes was that someone, and we're still living with the consequences. The story doesn't end with his death. Ideas don't die with their creators. They evolve, transform, get taken up by new thinkers who push them in unexpected directions. Descartes' ideas were about to encounter their most formidable challenges, not from theologians or church officials, from other philosophers who took his method seriously and used it to undermine his conclusions. They would accept his starting point, his demand for certainty, his systematic approach, and they would arrive at radically different destinations. The first wave came from within the Cartesian tradition itself, philosophers who called themselves Cartesians but who couldn't accept mind-body dualism. They saw the problem immediately. If mind and body are completely different substances, how do they interact? How does my decision to raise my arm cause my physical arm to rise? Descartes had waved this away with the pineal gland theory. His successors weren't satisfied. They developed alternative systems. Occasionalism, which said God intervenes every time mind and body need to interact. Parallelism, which said mind and body run on separate tracks that merely appear to interact. Each solution raised new problems. Then came the empiricists, John Locke in England, George Berkeley in Ireland, David Hume in Scotland. They accepted Descartes' demand for certainty, but rejected his rationalism. Knowledge doesn't come from innate ideas or pure reason, they argued. It comes from experience, from observation, from the senses. This was a direct challenge to Cartesian foundations. If all knowledge comes from experience, then we can't have certain knowledge of anything beyond experience. We can't prove the external world exists. We can't prove other minds exist. We can't even prove the self exists as anything more than a bundle of perceptions. Hume took this to its logical conclusion. He showed that even causation, the most basic principle we use to understand the world, can't be proven. We see one event follow another. We assume a connection, but we never observe causation itself. It's just habit, custom, psychological expectation. The certainty Descartes sought was evaporating. His method, applied rigorously, was undermining his conclusions. This was philosophy eating itself, using Cartesian doubt to doubt Cartesian certainty. The crisis deepened. By the mid-17th century, philosophy was fragmenting. Rationalists and empiricists were talking past each other. Mind-body dualism was producing increasingly baroque solutions. Skepticism was becoming harder to answer. The project Descartes had started seemed to be collapsing. Then came Kant, Immanuel Kant, working in Königsberg, far from the centres of European philosophy. He'd been raised on rationalism, converted to empiricism by reading Hume, and then spent a decade trying to figure out how to save philosophy from its own sceptical conclusions. His answer was revolutionary. Both rationalists and empiricists are partly right and partly wrong, Kant argued. Knowledge requires both reason and experience. The mind isn't a blank slate, but neither does it contain innate ideas. It contains structures, frameworks, ways of organizing experience that are built into consciousness itself. Space and time aren't features of the external world. They're forms of human intuition. Causation isn't discovered in experience. It's a category the mind uses to organize experience. We can have certain knowledge, but only of the world as it appears to us, not as it exists independently. This was the Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus had shown that Earth revolves around the Sun rather than vice versa, Kant showed that objects conform to the structure of our minds rather than our minds conforming to objects. It was brilliant, it was systematic, and it was deeply Cartesian in method while being anti-Cartesian in conclusions. Kant saved philosophy by transforming it. He answered Hume's skepticism. He solved the mind-body problem by making it unanswerable. He showed why Descartes was both right and wrong. The transformation was complete. Philosophy after Kant would never be the same. But what did this mean for Descartes' legacy? Had Kant destroyed the Cartesian project or fulfilled it? The answer is both, and that's the strange genius of what happened. Kant demolished Descartes' specific conclusions while vindicating his method. The cogito survived. The certain knowledge of the external world did not. The demand for systematic philosophy survived. The rationalist confidence in pure reason did not. Consider what Kant preserved. The insistence that philosophy must be rigorous, systematic, grounded in clear principles. That was Cartesian, the belief that reason has a central role in knowledge. That was Cartesian, the conviction that we can discover universal truths through careful analysis. That was Cartesian. Now, consider what he rejected, the idea that mind and body are separate substances. Gone. The notion that clear and distinct ideas guarantee truth about reality. Gone. The assumption that reason alone can tell us about the external world. Gone. Descartes built a house. Kant tore it down and used the materials to build something new. The foundation shifted, the structure changed, but the tools, the methods, the commitment to building systematically, those remained. Philosophy in the 19th century became a series of responses to Kant. German idealism took his insights and pushed them further. Fichte eliminated the thing in itself entirely. If we can't know it, why assume it exists? Schelling tried to reunite subject and object in a philosophy of nature. Hegel claimed to trace the development of absolute spirit through history. Each built on Kant's foundation while rejecting his limits. Then came the counter-movements. Schopenhauer accepted Kant's framework, but filled it with pessimism and will. Nietzsche rejected the entire tradition, including Kant, as life-denying metaphysics. Marx turned philosophy materialist, claiming that consciousness reflects economic conditions rather than structuring reality. But notice something. They're all still responding to problems Descartes raised. The relationship between mind and world, the possibility of certain knowledge, the nature of the self, the role of reason. Descartes set the agenda. His successors kept debating it even when they rejected his answers. Meanwhile, science was transforming. The physics Descartes had tried to deduce from first principles became experimental and mathematical. Newton's laws replaced Cartesian vortices. Observation and measurement replaced rational deduction. Chemistry emerged as a discipline distinct from alchemy. Biology began systematic classification and eventually evolutionary theory. Yet Descartes' influence persisted here too. The mechanical worldview, the assumption that nature operates according to discoverable laws, the belief that mathematics describes physical reality, these were Cartesian ideas that science absorbed and refined. Scientists stopped trying to deduce everything from first principles, but they kept the conviction that the world is intelligible, ordered, subject to rational investigation. Medicine moved beyond Descartes' primitive physiology, but it kept his mechanistic approach. The body as machine, disease as malfunction, treatment as repair. This framework, crude in Descartes' hands, became sophisticated as anatomy advanced, as physiology developed, as the germ theory emerged. The metaphor Descartes introduced proved durable, even as the details changed completely. Psychology eventually broke away from philosophy, but it couldn't escape Cartesian problems. The mind-body problem haunted every attempt to create a science of consciousness. Behaviorists tried to eliminate mind entirely, studying only observable behavior. That didn't work. Cognitive scientists tried to model mind as information processing. That helped, but left hard problems unsolved. Neuroscience now maps brain activity correlated with mental states. We can watch thoughts happen in real time. Yet the explanatory gap remains. Why does this pattern of neural firing feel like something? How does objective physical process become subjective experience? We've made enormous progress since Descartes. We haven't solved his problem. The 20th century brought new challenges. Phenomenology, founded by Husserl, returned to Cartesian themes with new sophistication. How do things appear to consciousness? What's the structure of experience itself? Husserl even called for a return to Descartes, though his conclusions differed dramatically. Existentialism, particularly in Sartre, wrestled with freedom and consciousness. Sartre's claim that existence precedes essence echoes Cartesian themes while inverting them. For Descartes, the thinking thing discovers its essence through reflection. For Sartre, consciousness creates its own essence through choice. Different conclusions, same territory. Analytic philosophy in the English-speaking world took a different path. It rejected grand metaphysical systems. It focused on language, logic, precise analysis of specific problems. But even here, Cartesian influence persisted. The problem of other minds, the question of skepticism, the analysis of knowledge and certainty. These remained central topics, reformulated in new vocabulary, but fundamentally unchanged. Artificial intelligence emerged in the mid-20th century with explicitly Cartesian ambitions. If thinking is computation, if mind is software running on brain hardware, then we can create thinking machines. This is Descartes' mechanistic vision applied to cognition itself. It's produced remarkable technology and deepened old puzzles. Can machines really think? Would they be conscious? How would we know? The questions multiply faster than the answers. Contemporary philosophy of mind has fractured into competing schools. Dualism has few defenders now, but the alternatives proliferate. Materialism in various forms, functionalism, eliminativism, panpsychism, each trying to explain how consciousness fits into a physical world, each failing to satisfy everyone. The problem Descartes crystallized remains unsolved. What about mathematics and logic? Descartes' faith in their certainty faced challenges too. Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed that formal systems can't prove their own consistency. There are true mathematical statements that can't be proven within a system. This doesn't refute Descartes exactly, but it complicates his picture. Certainty has limits, even in mathematics. The foundations of mathematics became contested. Logicism tried to reduce math to logic. Formalism treated it as symbol manipulation. Intuitionism required constructive proofs. Each program faced difficulties. The simple Cartesian confidence that mathematics provides certain truth about clear and distinct ideas gave way to recognition of deeper complexities. Physics brought even stranger challenges. Relativity showed that space and time aren't absolute. They're relative to reference frames. Quantum mechanics introduced fundamental uncertainty. Particles don't have definite properties until measured. The observer affects the observed. Reality at the smallest scales refuses to behave like Descartes' clockwork universe. Does this vindicate Kant's claim that we can only know appearances, not things in themselves? Or does it suggest something stranger? Physicists debate interpretations, but Descartes' dream of deducing physics from first principles is dead. Nature is weirder than rational deduction could have predicted, yet his influence remains in unexpected places. Computer science inherited his coordinate system. Every pixel on your screen has Cartesian coordinates. Every 3D model uses his geometry. The tools he invented for philosophy became essential for technology. That's a strange legacy. Cognitive science uses Cartesian vocabulary constantly. We talk about representations, about processing, about the interface between perception and cognition. The mind as computer metaphor is deeply Cartesian, even though Descartes never imagined computers. His mechanistic approach adapted to new technology. Political philosophy shows his influence too. The social contract tradition that runs from Hobbes through Locke to Rawls is fundamentally Cartesian in method. Start with individuals in a state of nature. Deduce what rational agents would agree to. Construct a just society from first principles. This is Descartes' method applied to politics. Rights theory is Cartesian. The idea that individuals possess inherent rights prior to society, that these can be discovered through reason, that political legitimacy depends on respecting them, this framework dominates modern political thought. Descartes didn't invent it, but his philosophical method enabled it. Even postmodern philosophy, which rejects Cartesian certainty, defines itself against Descartes. Derrida's deconstruction targets the metaphysics of presence that Descartes exemplified. Foucault's genealogies challenge Cartesian rationalism. Rorty's pragmatism abandons the search for foundations. Each positions itself as post-Cartesian, which means Descartes remains the reference point. Feminist philosophy has complicated the picture further. The Cartesian subject, the pure thinking thing abstracted from body and context, looks suspiciously like a particular kind of person. Male, European, educated, privileged. What about embodied knowledge? What about situated perspectives? What about the ways gender, race, class shape thought? These critiques are powerful. They reveal blindnesses in the Cartesian tradition. Yet they often use Cartesian tools: systematic analysis, logical argument, the demand for consistency. The tradition contains resources for its own critique. Environmental philosophy faces similar tensions. Descartes' dualism between mind and matter, his view of nature as mere mechanism, his confidence that humans stand apart from and above the natural world. These ideas have been blamed for ecological crisis. If nature is just matter in motion, why not exploit it? Yet environmental ethics also uses Cartesian reasoning. If we can deduce moral obligations toward humans, why not toward animals? Toward ecosystems? The method extends even as conclusions shift. Singer and Regan build animal rights arguments using precisely the kind of rational analysis Descartes pioneered. Medical ethics inherited both Cartesian problems and methods. The definition of death has moved from heart to brain because we're Cartesian enough to identify persons with minds. Debates about consciousness in vegetative states, about animal experimentation, about enhancement versus therapy, all invoke Cartesian distinctions while arguing about where to draw lines. Bioethics wrestles with mind-body questions constantly. When does personhood begin? When does it end? What's the moral status of embryos, fetuses, the severely brain-damaged? These aren't just medical questions. They're philosophical questions rooted in how we understand the relationship between biological organism and conscious subject. Neuroscience raises new versions of old puzzles. We can manipulate mood with drugs, alter personality with brain lesions, induce religious experiences with magnetic stimulation. This seems to support materialism. The mind is the brain, but the hard problem remains. Why does brain activity feel like something from the inside? Free will debates continue. Neuroscientists find brain activity preceding conscious decisions. Does this mean decisions are made before we're aware of them? That consciousness is an epiphenomenon? Or are we misunderstanding the relationship between neural activity and mental causation? The problem Descartes faced when explaining how immaterial mind moves, material body has new form, but hasn't disappeared. Consciousness studies have exploded in recent decades. The field didn't exist in Descartes' time. Now it's a major research area combining philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, artificial intelligence. What's remarkable is how Cartesian the core questions remain. What is consciousness? How does it relate to physical processes? Can we explain subjective experience in objective terms? Some researchers claim progress. We're mapping neural correlates of consciousness. We're developing theories of integrated information or global workspace. We're distinguishing different aspects of consciousness. But the explanatory gap that Descartes opened persists. No current theory fully explains why there's something it's like to be conscious. The simulation hypothesis is perhaps the most Cartesian idea in contemporary philosophy. What if reality is a computer simulation? What if we're brains in vats, or digital minds in a matrix? These scenarios update Descartes' evil demon. They use modern technology to pose his ancient question: how do you know you're not being deceived? Most people don't take the simulation hypothesis seriously as a practical concern, but it clarifies something about knowledge. If you can't tell the difference between reality and a perfect simulation, then your evidence can't distinguish them. This is Cartesian skepticism with better special effects. Virtual reality technology makes it more concrete. Put on a headset and you're in another world. Your senses report things that aren't physically present. You know it's fake, but the experience is real. This is Descartes' thought experiment made literal. The distinction between appearance and reality matters differently when we can engineer appearances. So where does this leave us? After 4 centuries, what's Descartes' legacy? The specific system he built has collapsed. Nobody defends Cartesian dualism in its original form. His physics is obsolete. His physiology is primitive. Many of his arguments are recognized as flawed, yet his influence is everywhere. In how we frame problems, in what we consider important questions, in the methods we use to approach them, in the vocabulary we employ. Philosophy after Descartes is still responding to Descartes, even when rejecting him. Perhaps the deepest legacy is methodological. Descartes taught philosophy to start from first principles, to question everything, to build systematically from secure foundations. This approach shaped modern thought, even when people disagreed with his conclusions. Science adopted the method while rejecting the metaphysics. Clear and distinct ideas became empirical verification. The cogito became experimental evidence. But the demand for certainty, for foundations, for systematic knowledge remained Cartesian. The Enlightenment was Cartesian in spirit. Reason could illuminate everything. Knowledge could be systematic. Human beings could understand the world and improve it through rational inquiry. Voltaire championed Newtonian physics partly because it vindicated the Cartesian program of mathematical natural philosophy, even while rejecting Descartes' specific theories. The French encyclopedists pursued Cartesian goals through different means. Kant tried to overcome the division between rationalism and empiricism that Descartes helped create, but Kant's entire project presupposed Cartesian questions. How is knowledge possible? What are the limits of reason? How do mind and world relate? These are Descartes' questions. Kant's answers differed radically. The framework remained. Modern epistemology is post-Cartesian, but not non-Cartesian. We've moved beyond foundationalism in its strict form. Most philosophers accept that knowledge doesn't require absolute certainty, but the questions Descartes raised about justification, about the structure of knowledge, about skepticism remain central. Coherentism, reliabilism, virtue epistemology are responses to problems Descartes articulated. Philosophy of mind is even more obviously Cartesian territory. Every theory must position itself relative to dualism. You're either defending some version of it, rejecting it entirely, or trying to find middle ground. Functionalism claims mental states are defined by their causal roles, not their physical composition. This allows minds to be multiply realizable. Same function, different substrate. It's anti-Cartesian in denying that minds are non-physical substances. But it preserves something Cartesian, the thought that mental and physical are conceptually distinct categories. Emergentism argues that consciousness emerges from physical complexity without being reducible to it. New properties arise at higher levels of organization. This tries to acknowledge both physical basis and mental reality. It's neither pure materialism nor dualism, but it faces Cartesian problems in new form. How exactly does emergence work? What's the relationship between emergent properties and base properties? The explanatory gap reappears. Panpsychism has recently gained supporters among philosophers who think materialism can't explain consciousness. Maybe consciousness is fundamental, present at all levels of reality, not just in complex brains. This ancient idea, updated for modern science, still grapples with Cartesian puzzles. How do simple conscious entities combine into complex consciousness? How does physical interaction relate to mental combination? Eliminativism takes the opposite approach. Mental states, as we conceive them, don't exist. Folk psychology is false. Beliefs, desires, sensations are theoretical posits of a bad theory that will be replaced by neuroscience. This radical materialism tries to dissolve rather than solve mind-body problems, but it must still explain why the illusion of consciousness is so compelling. Why does it seem like something from the inside if there's no inside? Each position has strengths and weaknesses. None has won decisive victory. The debate continues because the problem Descartes identified is real. we have first-person access to our own minds that differs qualitatively from third-person access to anything else. How these two perspectives relate remains mysterious. Personal identity debates stem from Cartesian questions too. What makes you the same person over time? Your body changes completely every few years. Your memories evolve, your personality develops. What's the continuity? Locke proposed psychological continuity. You're the same person who remembers your past experiences. This seems right but faces problems. False memories exist. Memory chains can break. Someone could remember being you without being you. Body-based theories say physical continuity matters. You're the same person because you're the same biological organism. This handles cases where psychology changes dramatically. Brain damage, amnesia, radical personality shifts don't create new persons. But it struggles with thought experiments. If your brain were transplanted to another body, where would you be? Most people intuit they'd follow their brain. That's Cartesian. Narrative theories emphasize the stories we tell about ourselves. Personal identity is constructed through autobiographical narrative. You're the main character in your life story. This captures something important about lived experience, but it seems to confuse the representation with what's represented. The story about you isn't what makes you you. No theory fully satisfies. Perhaps because the question assumes something false, that personal identity must have determinate answers in all cases. Maybe it's sometimes indeterminate who's who. Ship of Theseus. Paradoxes suggest boundaries blur. Descartes wouldn't have accepted this. He believed the thinking thing was simple, indivisible, clearly bounded. We're less confident but still asking his question. Artificial intelligence poses Cartesian questions with new urgency. Can machines think? Descartes said no. Animals are mechanisms without minds. Machines, by definition, lack consciousness. But what if we build machines complex enough? What if they pass every behavioural test? What if they claim to be conscious? Turing proposed his test as operational definition. If you can't tell whether you're conversing with human or machine, the machine thinks. This sidesteps metaphysics for pragmatics, but it doesn't satisfy. Maybe the machine simulates thought without actually thinking. Maybe it's philosophical zombie, behaviourally identical to conscious being, but with nobody home. The Chinese room argument makes this vivid. Someone who doesn't understand Chinese sits in room with rulebook for manipulating Chinese symbols. Questions come in, responses go out, all determined by rules. From outside it looks like Chinese comprehension. From inside it's mechanical symbol shuffling. No understanding occurs. If this is right, then syntactic operations never create semantic understanding. Computation alone never generates consciousness. Critics respond that the system, as whole, understands even if individual components don't, or that biological brains are also symbol manipulators, or that the argument proves too much, since it would apply to humans too. The debate continues. It's Cartesian doubt applied to artificial minds. Large language models complicate things further. They produce remarkably human-like text. They solve problems, write poetry, explain concepts. Do they understand? Are they conscious? Most researchers say no, but we can't be certain. The behavioural evidence is ambiguous. We're back to Descartes' problem. Other minds are known only through behaviour. If behaviour is indistinguishable, how do we tell? Some philosophers argue we should err on side of caution. If there's any chance artificial systems are conscious, we should treat them ethically. Others insist current systems are definitely not conscious, they're just pattern matching. The disagreement reveals how little we understand consciousness. Descartes knew his own mind immediately. Everything else required inference. We've made progress, but the gap remains. Ethics has Cartesian dimensions too. If humans are rational souls distinct from animal bodies, this grounds special moral status. We're ends in ourselves, never mere means. This idea runs through Kant, through human rights discourse, through contemporary bioethics. It's under pressure from evolutionary biology and neuroscience, which blur human-animal boundaries. But the intuition persists that persons matter morally in ways objects don't. Animal rights debates partly concern where to draw lines. Are animals conscious? Do they suffer? Do they have interests that matter morally? Descartes' view that animals are unconscious automata is rejected by most people now, but questions about degrees of consciousness, about which capacities ground moral status, remain contested. Insects, fish, birds, mammals form spectrum. Where does moral consideration begin? Environmental ethics challenges human-centered focus entirely. Maybe value isn't limited to conscious beings. Maybe ecosystems, species, wilderness have intrinsic worth. This is deeply un-Cartesian. Descartes saw nature as resource for human use. Mathematical laws govern dead matter. Value exists only in minds. Environmentalism requires different framework. But even here, Cartesian questions arise. Is nature valuable, independent of conscious beings? Or does value require a valuer? Political philosophy grapples with Cartesian themes. What's the relationship between individual and society? Descartes' thinking thing is fundamentally individual. The cogito is first person. Society is collection of individuals. This atomistic view shapes liberal political theory. Rights belong to persons. Government exists to protect individual freedom. Community is voluntary association of separate selves. Communitarian critics argue this gets human nature wrong. We're social beings from the start. Identity is partly constituted by relationships and communities. There's no pre-social self. This challenges Cartesian individualism. But even communitarians must explain how individual and collective relate. The tension between autonomy and belonging is partly Cartesian inheritance. Feminism has particularly sharp critique of Descartes. The mind-body split maps onto gender stereotypes. Men are rational minds, women are emotional bodies. Men think, women feel. Men are subjects, women are objects. This dualism reinforced oppression by associating women with the devalued bodily side. Feminist philosophy emphasizes embodiment, emotion, care, relationship. It rejects the ideal of pure rational subject detached from physical and social context. The critique cuts deep. Maybe Descartes' entire project reflects masculine anxiety about bodies, birth, dependence, mortality. The dream of pure thought separate from flesh is gendered fantasy. We're always already embodied. Knowledge is situated, perspectival, partial. There's no view from nowhere. This challenges Cartesian epistemology fundamentally. Yet feminist philosophy still engages with Cartesian questions. How should we understand embodied experience? What's the relationship between physical body and lived body? How do social categories shape subjectivity? These are mind-body questions in different register. The framework shifts, but the underlying puzzles remain. Phenomenology also responds to Descartes while transforming the project. Husserl wanted philosophy to return to the things themselves, to describe experience as lived, rather than theorizing about hypothetical substances. He used methodological doubt, similar to Descartes', bracket natural attitude, suspend assumptions, examine what remains. But instead of reaching isolated thinking thing, phenomenology finds consciousness, as always, already world-directed. Intentionality is fundamental. Consciousness is consciousness of something. Heidegger radicalized this. Being in the world is primary. Cartesian subject-object split is derivative, arising from breakdown of practical engagement. We don't start as detached minds observing external world. We start as absorbed actors, using equipment, pursuing projects, embedded in meaningful contexts. The theoretical stance Descartes made fundamental is actually secondary mode we adopt when things go wrong. Merleau-Ponty emphasized bodily existence. We're not minds possessing bodies, we are our bodies. embodied consciousness perceives world through bodily capacities and limitations. The body subject is neither pure mind nor mere object. It's lived experience that transcends Cartesian categories. Phantom limb experiences, body schema, motor intentionality all reveal embodiment's complexity. Existentialism inherited Cartesian emphasis on subjectivity while rejecting substances. Sartre distinguished being in itself, dense inert existence of objects, from being for itself, the nothingness at heart of consciousness. Consciousness is not thing but activity, perpetual transcendence toward possibilities. Freedom is burden, not achievement. We're condemned to choose, to make ourselves through decisions. This inverts Descartes' substance dualism while preserving subjective perspective. All these movements react against Cartesianism while remaining on terrain Descartes mapped. They reject his answers, but accept his questions matter. The vocabulary shifts, the problems persist. Continental philosophy, after Descartes, is sustained engagement with Cartesian themes, even when explicitly anti-Cartesian. Postmodernism questions the whole enterprise. Maybe there's no unified self, no essential human nature, no foundation for knowledge. The thinking subject is fiction, construct of language and power. Foucault analysed how concepts of mind, madness, sexuality were historically produced through institutional practices. There's no pre-discursive reality of consciousness waiting to be discovered. Derrida deconstructed presence, immediacy, self-transparency, showing how they depend on what they exclude. This challenges Cartesian certainty most radically. The cogito itself becomes questionable. Maybe I think, therefore I am smuggles in assumptions about I, about think, about am. Maybe introspection doesn't reveal transparent self-presence, but infinite regress of interpretation. Maybe consciousness is effect, not foundation. Yet even postmodern skepticism is recognizably Cartesian in form. It pushes doubt further than Descartes did. It questions what he took as certain. But it uses his tools: radical questioning, exposure of hidden assumptions, refusal of dogma. The method survives the conclusions. Descartes created intellectual climate where everything becomes questionable. That's his most lasting achievement. Not the specific doctrines, but the attitude. Question authority, doubt inherited wisdom, demand reasons, accept only what survives scrutiny. This is modern philosophical temperament. We're all Cartesians now, whether we know it or not. The scientific revolution wouldn't have happened without this shift. Medieval scholastics deferred to Aristotle, to scripture, to tradition. Descartes said, trust only what you can prove. Mathematics became model, clear, distinct, certain. Physics should be like geometry, deduce truths from self-evident axioms. This was wildly optimistic about reason's power, but it liberated inquiry. Scientists stopped asking what Aristotle said and started asking what actually happens. They measured, experimented, calculated. They treated nature as mechanism following mathematical laws. This was Cartesian vision made concrete. Newton's Principia is Cartesian physics perfected. Universal gravitation explained planetary motion, tides, falling objects through single mathematical framework. Everything reduced to matter in motion, governed by equations. No purposes, no essences, no occult qualities, just particles and forces. Descartes would have approved the method even if he rejected specific theories. He thought the vortices explained celestial mechanics. He was wrong. But he was wrong scientifically. That's progress. Biology resisted mechanization longer. Living things seem purposeful. Hearts pump blood, eyes see, organisms maintain themselves. Hard to explain as pure mechanism. Yet eventually, molecular biology vindicated mechanical approach. DNA, proteins, cellular machinery. Life is chemistry, following physical laws, No vital force needed. Descartes dreamed of explaining animals as automatons. Modern neuroscience tries explaining humans the same way. We're biological machines, sophisticated but ultimately comprehensible through science. Consciousness might be last holdout, but many researchers think it too will yield to mechanistic explanation eventually. This raises ancient question in new form. If we're machines, do we have free will? Descartes thought mind was separate from mechanical body, so freedom was possible. But if mind is brain, if brain is physical system following natural laws, how can we be free? Every thought, every choice, every action might be determined by prior causes stretching back before our birth. We feel free, but maybe that's illusion. Physics seems to leave no room for genuine agency. Some philosophers accept this. Hard determinism says, free will is incompatible with determinism, and determinism is true, so free will doesn't exist. We're deluded about our own nature. Moral responsibility becomes problematic. How can we blame people for actions they couldn't avoid? How can we praise them for choices that weren't really choices? The criminal is product of genetics and environment. The hero too. Nobody deserves credit or punishment because nobody could have done otherwise. Others try saving free will through compatibilism. Freedom doesn't require breaking causal chains. It requires acting on your own desires, beliefs, character. You're free when external constraints don't prevent you from doing what you want. The fact that your wants are caused doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're acting on them or being forced against them. This preserves moral responsibility while accepting determinism. We can still praise and blame because those practices influence future behaviour, even in deterministic world. Libertarians about free will, not political sense, insist genuine freedom requires indeterminism. Some appeal to quantum mechanics. Subatomic events are probabilistic, not deterministic. Maybe consciousness exploits quantum indeterminacy, introducing genuine randomness into brain processes. Then our choices wouldn't be fully determined by prior states. But randomness isn't obviously freedom either. If my decision is random quantum fluctuation, it's not really my decision. It's just chance. Freedom seems to require control, not mere unpredictability. Others appeal to agent causation. Maybe persons are causes in special sense, not reducible to events. When I choose, I cause the choice, not prior brain states causing it, not random quantum events causing it, me causing it. This preserves intuition that we're responsible for our actions, but it's mysterious how agent causation works. What is this power? How does immaterial agent influence physical brain? We're back to interaction problem that plagued Descartes. The free will debate continues because it touches fundamental questions about human nature. Are we subjects or objects, agents or mechanisms, authors of our actions or products of forces beyond our control? Descartes made these questions urgent by mechanizing nature while exempting mind. Once mind rejoins nature, the questions become harder, not easier. Science progresses, but philosophical puzzles remain. Artificial intelligence raises Cartesian questions with new intensity. Can machines think? Turing proposed operational test. If computers' responses are indistinguishable from humans, we should say it thinks. This sidesteps question of inner experience. Focus on behavior, not consciousness. Many AI researchers follow this approach. Build systems that perform intelligent tasks. Don't worry whether they're really thinking or just simulating thought. But Searle's Chinese room challenges this. Imagine person in room receiving Chinese characters, following rules for manipulating them, producing Chinese responses. From outside, system appears to understand Chinese, but person inside doesn't understand. They're just following instructions. Similarly, computer might process information without understanding anything. Syntax doesn't guarantee semantics. Symbol manipulation isn't meaning. This revives Cartesian worry. Maybe there's difference between really thinking and merely appearing to think. maybe consciousness matters. A philosophical zombie, being physically identical to conscious person but lacking subjective experience, would process information identically. Yet something crucial would be missing: the what it's likeness, the inner light. This seems metaphysically possible, even if physically impossible. And if it's metaphysically possible, then consciousness is something over and above physical processes. Functionalists disagree. Mental states are functional states. What makes something belief isn't its physical composition, but its causal role. Beliefs are states that are caused by perception, that interact with desires to produce behavior, that update in response to evidence. Anything that plays this functional role has beliefs. Doesn't matter if it's neurons, silicon chips, or mechanical gears. Mind is software, not hardware. This allows for artificial intelligence and alien intelligence. If extraterrestrials think differently than us physiologically, they can still have minds because mind is organizational pattern, not material substrate. Yet consciousness seems to resist functional analysis. We can describe pain's functional role. It's caused by tissue damage. It motivates withdrawal. It produces characteristic behaviors. But functional description seems to leave out what pain feels like: the hurt, the badness. This is called explanatory gap. How do we get from physical or functional description to subjective experience? Why does information processing feel like anything at all? Eliminativists say we don't get there because consciousness, as traditionally understood, doesn't exist. Folk psychology is false theory. When neuroscience matures, we'll stop talking about beliefs, desires, sensations. We'll describe brain states directly. Consciousness will go the way of phlogiston and vital force, discarded as confused concept from prescientific era. This seems radical, but it's logical endpoint of materialist program. If mind is brain and brain is just complex neural network, why should processing feel like anything? Maybe it doesn't, and we're mistaken about our own inner lives. Most philosophers resist this. Consciousness seems undeniable. Descartes was right about one thing. I can doubt external world, other minds, even my own body, but I can't doubt that I'm conscious. Experience is immediately present. Whatever else is illusion, experience of illusion is real. This makes consciousness bedrock. Any theory denying it denies the obvious. The hard problem of consciousness, as Chalmers calls it, remains unsolved. We've made progress on easy problems. How do we discriminate stimuli? How do we integrate information? How do we control behavior? These are difficult but tractable. Neuroscience can address them. The hard problem is different. Why does information processing produce subjective experience? Why is there something it's like to be me? We don't even know what form answer should take. This is Cartesian legacy, the mystery of consciousness, the explanatory gap, the mind-body problem. All descendants of Descartes' dualism. Perhaps problem is permanent. Maybe consciousness can't be explained because explanation requires reducing something to more basic elements, and consciousness is as basic as it gets. Or maybe we need conceptual revolution we can't currently imagine. Newton couldn't have predicted quantum mechanics. We can't predict what future science will discover. The framework might shift so radically that our questions become obsolete. But for now, we're stuck with Cartesian problematic. Mind and world, subject and object, consciousness and matter. These dichotomies structure our thinking. Even attempts to overcome them remain within their orbit. We can't think our way outside the categories that make thought possible. This is Kant's insight, but it applies to Descartes too. The Cartesian framework is so foundational that rejecting it is difficult. We're fish trying to see the water. Consider politics and ethics. Liberal democracy rests on Cartesian assumptions. Individuals are fundamental. They have inherent rights. Government must respect their autonomy. This is social contract theory. Free rational agents agree to political arrangement, protecting their interests. Nobody is natural subordinate to anyone else. All persons are equal. These ideas emerged from Enlightenment thinkers building on Cartesian foundation. If minds are substances, if persons are thinking things, then they have intrinsic worth independent of social roles. You're not valuable because you're nobleman or priest or father. You're valuable because you're rational, being capable of thought and choice. This transformed political philosophy. Instead of justifying hierarchy through divine right or natural order, liberalism grounds authority in consent. Governments are legitimate only if people accept them. Laws are justified only if they treat persons as ends, not means. This is Kantian formulation, but the spirit is Cartesian. Individuals come first. Society is constructed from their choices. Traditional communities that subordinated individuals to collective were obstacles to freedom. Modern politics aims to protect individual rights against state, church, family, tradition. Critics argue this impoverishes political life. Communitarians say we're not isolated atoms. We're constituted by relationships, traditions, communities. Identity is social, not individual. The self Descartes discovered through radical doubt is artificial abstraction. Real persons are embedded in contexts that make them who they are. Liberalism's focus on individual rights ignores how communities sustain meaningful lives. It produces alienation, anomie, loss of shared values. We need politics of common good, not just protection of private preferences. Marxists make similar point differently. Class not individual is fundamental unit of analysis. Consciousness is shaped by material conditions, by economic relationships, by historical forces. The autonomous rational subject is bourgeois fantasy. Real people are workers, capitalists, peasants. Their interests are determined by their position in mode of production. Liberal rights protect property owners while masking exploitation. True freedom requires transforming social structures, not defending individual choices. Feminists point out Cartesian subject is implicitly male. Reason, autonomy, independence are masculine ideals. They devalue care, emotion, connection, traits coded feminine. The social contract presupposes individuals who are already formed, already capable of rational choice. But who raised them? Who taught them? Who cares for them when they're vulnerable? Women's labour makes possible the independence men claim. The rational agent is fiction sustained by invisible domestic work. These critiques don't reject Cartesian insights entirely. They argue Descartes was too narrow. He captured part of human reality, but mistook it for the whole. We are thinking subjects, but also bodies, members of communities, products of history, embedded in relationships. Mind matters, but so does matter. Reason matters, but so does emotion. Individuals matter, but so do collectives. The challenge is integrating these dimensions without reducing one to another. Maybe dualism persists because it reflects genuine tension. We are both subjects and objects. First-person and third-person perspectives are both valid, but they don't reduce to each other. I experience myself from inside. Others observe me from outside. Science requires objectivity. Ethics requires subjectivity. We need both. The goal isn't eliminating dualism, but managing it. Understanding how these perspectives relate without forcing unity that distorts. Descartes died believing he'd solved fundamental problems. He hadn't, but he'd asked the right questions. He'd established the terms. He'd created the philosophical landscape we still navigate. 4 centuries later, we argue about mind, knowledge, reality, freedom using concepts he developed. The cogito might be flawed. Dualism might be untenable, but the issues he raised are permanent. As long as we think about thinking, wonder about knowing, puzzle over existence, we'll be engaged with Cartesian themes. His ghost haunts philosophy, not because he was right, because he was unavoidable. The man who doubted everything left us with certainties we can't escape. Not the certainties he claimed to find. Those collapsed almost immediately under scrutiny. But the certainty that these questions matter. That consciousness is real, even if we can't explain it. That knowledge requires justification, even if foundations are elusive. That the relationship between mind and world is genuinely puzzling, not just confusion waiting to be cleared up by better vocabulary. We've spent 400 years trying to move beyond Descartes. Every generation announces his obsolescence. Dualism is dead, they declare. The cogito is refuted. The method is naive. The system is collapsed. And yet here we are, still wrestling with his problems, still using his distinctions, still unable to escape the territory he mapped. Maybe that's the real measure of philosophical importance. Not whether you solved the problems, but whether you identified problems that can't be solved away. Questions that persist through conceptual revolutions, through scientific progress, through cultural transformation. The mind-body problem survives in neuroscience labs. The skeptical challenge survives in epistemology seminars. The nature of consciousness survives in artificial intelligence research. Different vocabularies, same puzzles. Descartes wanted certainty. He gave us productive uncertainty instead. He wanted to prove God's existence. He gave skeptics their sharpest tools. He wanted to unite knowledge in a single system. He fragmented philosophy into competing schools still arguing about his legacy. The gap between intention and consequence has rarely been wider. But perhaps that's how ideas work at the deepest level. They escape their authors. They become what the world needs them to become, not what their creators intended. The boy who dreamed of fire and woke believing God had spoken became the man who taught humanity to trust nothing but reason. The devout Catholic who tried to defend faith became the patron saint of secular philosophy. The systematic thinker who built elaborate metaphysical castles became the demolition expert, showing us how to tear down inherited certainties. Every contradiction was productive. Every failure mattered. He never left that room where he lay thinking. Not really. The rest was just details, biography, the external facts that historians record. The real action happened in his mind, in the systematic doubt, in the attempt to rebuild knowledge from foundations he could trust. That project continues. We're all still in that room, still doubting, still seeking certainty, still trying to understand how thinking things can know anything at all about a world that exists independently of thought. The cogito survives not because it's bulletproof, but because it captures something undeniable about the human condition. We are conscious, we do think, and that fact, whatever else we doubt, remains stubbornly present. Descartes was wrong about what follows from it. He was right that it matters. Consciousness is the scandal at the heart of a physical universe. Subjectivity is the mystery that materialism can't dissolve. Experience is the datum that every theory must account for. He saw this clearly even if his solution was flawed. 4 centuries, countless refutations, endless critiques. And still we return to Descartes. Still we teach the Meditations to students. Still we use his examples, engage his arguments, wrestle with his legacy. Not because we agree with him, because we can't think about thinking without him. The water we swim in is partly Cartesian. The intellectual oxygen we breathe contains elements he introduced. We're products of the revolution he started even when we rebel against it. The starry heavens above and the moral law within, Kant's famous words. But Descartes made that combination thinkable. External world governed by mathematical laws, internal world of consciousness and choice. The split between them. The puzzle of how they relate, the sense that we're both part of nature and somehow standing outside it, observing it, trying to understand it. This is the Cartesian predicament. We're embedded and transcendent, objects and subjects, determined and free. The contradictions don't resolve, we live them.